Mr. Jarboe Russell is a former Nieman Fellow, which is a fellowship at Harvard that recognizes some of the most promising journalists. She has contributed to the New York Times, to Slate Magazine, the San Antonio Express News. Her last book was a biography of Lady Bird Johnson. And her latest one, which I just finished this morning, it's called The Train to Crystal City, and she sheds light on American internment camps in the 1940s. She writes about how Crystal City, which was a small desert town at the southern tip of Texas, became the destination for thousands of Japanese, German, and also some Italian internees who, as she writes, were never charged with any crime and did not understand why they had been forced from their homes. And of course, that especially pertains to the children. In order to put the story together, Mr. Jarboe Russell interviewed more than 50 living internees from the camp. She consulted private journals, diaries, FBI files, and more. She was just now telling me a story about poring over records from the National Archives, scanning tens of thousands of pages. So it's pretty impressive work. I think that Ms. Jarboe Russell is at her best when describing the day-to-day existence of life inside the camps, about the Texas guardsmen who patrolled by horseback around the perimeter, about the rivalries that formed among the internees, about the swimming pool that the internees built to help combat the hot Texas summer heat, and about the scorpions and the fat snakes who were, of course, the original inhabitants of that campground. So to me, this is a really important history that's never been told. Ms. Russell dips into the American Historical Archive in order for us, I think, to confront a past that I think it's possible we haven't really confronted before about what it means to be an American citizen. So as Russell says of one of the internees that she finds in her later years who remembered life in the camp, time was short and she had a story to tell. So let's listen now to some of those stories, and if you'd help me by welcoming Jan Jarboe Russell.
First of all, thank you for coming out on this snowy night. I know it took a lot, and I really appreciate it. I was afraid there would be 7 people here, which would have been fine, but what a nice crowd it is. I also want to recognize a couple of very important friends who are journalists here, and I'm honored. And in my past, Karen Tumulty from the Washington Post, and Dee Cohn was a Nieman Fellow with me at Harvard, and we've enjoyed today catching up. I think the best way to do this tonight, hi Anna, it's nice to see you. I think the best way to do it is to just introduce you to to the main characters in the book and tell you some things about them along the way. I first learned about the Crystal City internment camp about 42 years ago from this man on the left, whose name is Alan Taniguchi. I was a young journalism major at the University of Texas, hook 'em horns, and Alan was the dean of the School of Architecture. And I went to a faculty senate meeting, and I was from a very small town in East Texas, and I'd never before in my life seen anyone of Asian descent. It was that kind of an upbringing. And so I asked Alan where he was from, and he said Brentwood, California. And so he then told me that his parents, Azumi and Sadeo, were born in Japan, but that he had been born in Brentwood. So I asked him a question that Texans always ask everybody: how did you get to Texas? And he said, my family was in camp here. And I said, church camp? And he said, not exactly. And that was the beginning. And over time, I got to know Sadeo and Azumi and his brother. And time passed. And every time I saw him, he would tell me something new about the Crystal City internment camp. But it didn't ever really click to me until 2010, when I went back to see Alan one day, and I'd learned from his son that he had died. And I realized that this is a terrible thing for a journalist when you realize you've lost the story that got away, right? And so I started talking to Evan, and Evan gave me, over the course of our conversation, his father's file about Crystal City. I opened it and saw a list of names of children who were incarcerated in the camp. The children on the list were now old men and women who lived all over the world. The next day, I slowly started telephoning them. And slowly, the secrets of the Crystal City internment camp and its sorrowful inhabitants began to unfold. During the war, Crystal City was the only family internment camp which housed multiple nationalities: German Americans, Germans, Japanese and Japanese Americans, and a few Italians. And the purpose of the camp was twofold. One was a humanitarian purpose, to reunite enemy alien fathers who were treated as prisoners of war with their families in Crystal City. And the second reason is that Crystal City was the center of Roosevelt's prisoner exchange program. Thousands of internees, including their children, were traded for more important Americans, diplomats, businessmen, soldiers, and missionaries behind enemy lines in Japan and Germany. I tell the book from the primary point of view of two American-born teenage girls who were interned in Crystal City and traded into war. This is the part of American internment you know about. The roundup of 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans. Two-thirds of them were American-born citizens. And this family is the Fukuda family from San Francisco. And he was a minister of the Konko religion. And these beautiful photographs were taken by Dorothea Lange, the famous photographer. And I just start it with this, because this is what happens when you're arrested or you're taken. Life changes in an instant. These photos are so beautiful that they hung on in my office wall. This is the same picture of the family, and on the day they were evacuated in San Francisco. I love this one. It's sort of mother and child. This is Shinko and her son, Hiroshi. Here's the two characters that they sort of tell the tale. This is Sumi in the middle, and these are her parents and her sisters. This is taken before the war began. Sumi's father was born in Japan and her mother born in Japan, but Sumi was born in Los Angeles and grew up in Little Tokyo. And her father was a photographer in Los Angeles, and a lot of the reasons that enemy aliens were arrested was based upon their occupation. And a photographer was considered a potential spy because he could take pictures of military installations, and that's the reason that Tom was arrested. This is the family this is Matthias and Johanna Iserol on their wedding portrait. They came from Germany and first-generation immigrants, and this is their wedding in 1923. Matthias was an engineer in Cleveland, Ohio, and all of these children, Ingrid with the unfortunate perm, and her babysitter sister Incy, and her brother Lothar. This photo was taken immediately after Matthias was arrested. He was an engineer in Cleveland, Ohio, and the FBI decided that if he could build a bridge, he could probably blow one up. And so he was arrested again, no charges, and the family was separated. This photo was taken shortly after the arrest, and which is why they have those pinched smiles, I think, and shortly before they lost their family home in Strongsville, Ohio. This this is a picture of Earl Harrison, who on this side, who was the head of Roosevelt's Immigration and Naturalization Service. On the other one is Joseph O'Rourke, who was the commandant of the camp, the officer in charge of the camp. And Earl Harrison visited the small town of Crystal City on November 6, 1942, arriving by train from his home in Philadelphia. And it was he who chose the site, which was previously a migrant worker camp for Mexican laborers. And from Harrison's view, the isolated location of the camp, far from areas considered vital to the war effort, was a positive. It was as close to Siberia as we have in America. So, this is a little bit about the camp. This is a picture of the camp. It was 290 acres, and in each of these little places, there were bungalows where families lived. And so what happened here is that week after week, month after month, from 1942 to 1948, trains with windows pulled shut carried approximately 6,000 civilians from all over the world across these flat plains to this small desert town. Not only did the Roosevelt administration arrest Germans, Japanese, and Italians on American soil, but they also orchestrated the removal of 4,058 Germans, 2,264 Japanese, and 288 Italians from 13 different Latin American countries. And they locked them up in around the United States, many in Crystal City. The reason that they were doing this is that they were trying to create a pool of people that could be exchanged for prisoners of war in Germany and in Japan. Ironically enough, as often happens, a lot about my book tallies the untallied cost of war. Some of those German Americans that were essentially kidnapped from Bolivia, 81 of them were Jews who had fled persecution in Germany and moved to Bolivia only to be rounded up and sent to an American internment camps. One of those families, the Jacobes, who happened to be from Colombia, were interned in Crystal City. Daily life. This is the camp, an aerial view of it, and that circle over there, that is the big swimming pool. It really wasn't a swimming pool. They had to have an irrigation ditch, and since it was 125 degrees in the summer there, the officer in charge, O'Rourke, decided to turn it into a swimming pool so that the children would have some place to go. There were guard towers every 200 feet, and guards on horseback, as seen here through the barbed wire fence, patrol the camp. The penalty for attempting to escape from the camp was death, and so everyone knew that, and in the entire history of the camp, not a single person ever tried to escape. These are the bungalows, and the Japanese Americans who had been in war relocation camps were really happy here because in the war relocation camps, they had to eat in mess halls. And in these camps, each one had a little kitchen, and so they could have family meals. There were roll calls 3 times a day. A whistle blew in the camp, and everyone had to run back to their cottages and to their huts, form lines, show their faces, and stand still for the count. Despite these harsh conditions, the children in the camp, most of them American, were really humanely treated. Every one of them that I interviewed said this. The camp had 3 schools. The American school, where Sumi went to school, which was a Texas Board of Education trained, was manned by teachers from the Texas Board of Education. and the Japanese school, which was taught by Japanese internees and fathers and mothers, and the German school that was taught by Germans. This is Sumi on this side right here. As a yell and song leader, essentially a cheerleader. O'Rourke really attempted to do everything he could to make life for the American-born children, especially, incredibly as normal as possible. The school had proms. They had newspapers and things like that. There's Sumi in her Girl Scout uniform. This is the German. It's not a medical staff. Those are beauticians and two barbers. The Japanese. This was their scout standing at attention. The Japanese workers made mattresses. They made all the clothes. Everything in the camp was done. And they were paid in camp tokens, that looked like casino chips, only they were paper. And the adults were paid 10 cents an hour, and they redeemed them for items in the camp store. This is, the Germans had a beer hall, and the rule was that you were supposed to only make the beer once a week, but this rule was routinely violated in the camp, and there they are. When the Germans got the beer hall, the Japanese said they wanted something. There was lots of conflict in the camp, and so they asked if they could have a tofu factory. And so we had the first Texas tofu factory built in Crystal City. This was building the pool. It was the German internees that built the pool, including Ingrid's father, Matthias, who had been the engineer in Cleveland. So the daily life, was family-based and organized. This is a photo of the Japanese internees bringing a Christmas tree into Crystal City. But one anecdote sort of tells a story about how far O'Rourke went to make sure to take care of the children. He was essentially followed around by the kids in the camp all the time, like a piper. And in 1943, Harrison, the big cheese from Washington, came down, and they took a little tour of the camp. And they encountered a group of Japanese boys playing war. And as O'Rourke asked, "What are you doing?" He said, and they answered, "Playing war." "Okay," said O'Rourke, "but I hope nobody gets killed." And so they continued on their tour. On the way back, they stopped at the same spot and found the children seated on the ground, looking glum and not playing on anything. "What happened to the war?" O'Rourke said. "It ended," they explained. "Nobody wanted to be the enemy. We all wanted to be the Americans." By far, the most jaw-dropping secret of life in Crystal City was the fact that the camp was at the center of FDR's prisoner exchange program. One of the lessons I learned in my research is that by whatever name it's called, internment, preventive detainment, or imprisonment, the practice of incarcerating immigrants with blood ties to countries in which the U.S. is at war always exists in part for the purpose of exchange. It works like a human chess game. Each side tries to get back their own citizens without giving up their highest valued prisoners. And that, figuring out the exchanges, was really the most interesting portion of the puzzle for me. The great tragedy of Crystal City is that many of those traded should have been of the highest values to Americans because many of them were American-born children. As this fact unfolded during years of research and with interviews with many of these children, now elderly men and women in their 80s, I found myself shaking my head in disbelief. It was in Crystal City that the machinery of modern internment and prisoner exchange was crafted on an industrial level. The first of 4 large prisoner exchanges took place in June 1942 and the second in September 2nd, 1943. During these 2 exchanges, more than 2,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were traded for other Americans imprisoned in Japan. In February 1944, 634 legal German residents, as well as their American-born children, were sent from Crystal City into Germany. On January the 2nd, 1945, 428 more in Crystal City were traded into war. I focused on the ordeals of the families of Sumi and Ingrid. Sumi was supposed to be traded into war in 1943, but because they had too many Japanese and Japanese Americans on the dock at the Jersey Pier, 97 of them were cut, and Sumi and her family were cut and taken to Crystal City and were traded at the end of the war into Japan. This is Sumi and them once in Christmas of 1945 after the trade. But Sumi is in the middle there. And Sumi is a very resilient person and very plucky, tomboyish. And so once the Americans occupied Sendai in Japan, which is where she and her family were living, Sumi and all these other kids from Crystal City, following Sumi's lead, got jobs at the American Air Force Base as translators. And as a result of that, they were able to keep their families alive during that period of time. And this is them when they, much later, when they go to Hawaii and then out from there to the West Coast to spend their lives. This is Sumi. Sumi married a member of the 442, which was the all-Japanese unit. He had terrible post-traumatic stress syndrome. They had all of these children, and Sumi said, in a way, it was fortunate he died young of a heart attack because he was a little bit of a handful as a husband, and Sumi was left with these children to raise. All of them have done extraordinarily well. This is Ingrid's family. Ingrid and her family were traded into, were traded into war in 1945 in an incredibly difficult exchange. The boat left New York. It got to Marseille in France, and then the exchange took place at a small village in Switzerland, and at that point, a train carrying Ingrid and her family and about 1,800 others from Crystal City and other places were stopped on the track going towards Germany, and another train was coming out of Germany filled with the people that were going to walk into freedom, some of them American POWs. And there's so many ironies in this book. Only when I was well into my research, I learned that there were 100 Jews from Bergen-Belsen that were freed as a result of that exchange. Essentially, America had run out of Americans to trade, and so 100 Jews were spared. And tonight we have with us the daughter of one of those Jews that was spared, Lori Gilbert. Lori, will you just stand? And that's his, and Patrice, and I have it, Patrice, yes. So the thing is that it's not an easy solution, this exchange situation. And when Ingrid learned that there were at least 100 Jews exchanged on the same exchange that she and her parents walked into hell, she was overjoyed. Her face went to her hands went to her face, and she said, I had the list of all the Jews that were saved, and she ran through each and every one with her finger and said, well, at least something good came from everything that my family went through. Irene and Jacob and Marie were spared. And so it offered some meaning to Ingrid, and then it also offered meaning to Jacob Wolf and to Irene Hassenberg, whose lives were spared as well. Irene and Ingrid were the same age, and they looked a whole lot alike. This is a picture of Irene, Jacob, and Marie. Laura, you want to show me which one's Marie? I can show you which one.
The second from left.
Right here.
In the bottom. Yeah, right. See
This is Irene, who looks very much like Ingrid. This is Marie. This is Jacob's father.
Marie's father also.
Marie's father. Yeah. And this is
That's Jacob.
That's Jacob.
That's my uncle, yeah.
So, they were taken, after they left Bergen-Belsen, they were taken to a displaced persons camp in Algeria, and then they made their way back. This is Irene, who lives in Ann Arbor and is an amazing warrior for peace. And this is Jacob, who just died this February. I don't have Marie's picture. Last February. This is Ingrid right after she got back from the war, and she married this person who was a German American who had fought in the war on the American side. This is Ingrid's whole family. She died on Pearl Harbor Day, 72 days to the day when her ordeal began in 2014. And these are her children, and that's her in the middle. That's Ingrid at her porch in our last interview, and that's me. In the course of my career as a writer, a single subject has often informed my work and definitely my mind. It's the subject articulated in the biblical story of Job that confronts the universal question, why do good people suffer? In my own life, the question has often been framed in a slightly different way. Suffering is, after all, universal, part of the human condition. We love people, we lose people. It happens to all of us. What then do we do when we don't know what to do? Over the course of all these years of research, the characters in my book have provided many answers to me for that question. Often I was incredibly inspired by the Japanese idea of gamon. Gamon is finding some sort of a practice, whether it's Buddhist meditation or calligraphy, judo, kendo, or tea ceremony, something that helped them persevere in the face of unendurable suffering. I was so inspired by the Iserl children, Ingrid, Lothar, and Ensi, who at every turn in this war obeyed the first commandment. They honored their father and mother, and at the same time did not lose faith in the country of their birth that had in fact betrayed them. The officials at Crystal City, Harris and O'Rourke, the many school teachers, the Border Patrol agents, saved our national honor by treating these internees inhumanely in a treacherous time. But finally, it was Irene Hassenberg, the Jewish girl from Amsterdam, freed from Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in the January 1945 trade, that provided for me the seminal lesson about how to deal with people in times of bitter conflict. Always remember, Irene told me during an interview at her home in Ann Arbor, enemies are people whose stories you haven't yet heard and whose faces you haven't seen. My gratitude goes to the characters in my book that had the courage, after 72 years, to tell the stories and show their faces. Thank you very much, and we'll take some questions. That's it. All right, who has the first question? Yes, sir. Would you mind stepping to the microphone?
Yes. I'm wondering, the parents that were traded back, were they obliging to go back, or why were they in the U.S. And eager to go back? Or
They weren't eager to go back, but in order to be reunited with their families in Crystal City, they had their fathers and their mothers had to be willing to voluntarily go back. And at that point, like in the case of Matthias and some of the other German and Japanese men whose children I talked to, by the time they were in Crystal City, the men had been in much harsher camps elsewhere, and they did not believe that they had any future in the United States. And so one can say that the children went as a consequence of being the children of these German and Japanese, because they couldn't separate the families after having brought them back together again. Is that a clear? Yeah. So words like voluntarily, they did use those words. We voluntarily agreed to be repatriated, but they didn't feel as if they had any choice, and they did not know how long the internment would last. The camp didn't close until 1948. Yes, sir.
My question follows that one, and it sounds a little crass, I suppose, but why did Nazi Germany want German Americans who were
They wanted them for they wanted engineers to come back to help them in the war effort, and so they wanted a lot of people that had some kind of skills that could help them. The other thing is, there were some people that in the Crystal City camp, including Fritz Kuhn, who was the leader of the American Nazi Party, who was a high value prisoner for Germany. They wanted him back. And so it's a little bit like the pawn games that you see now on a much smaller basis in today's wars. Certain prisoners had higher value than others.
And these German Americans had their loyalty, I am sure, was to America, not to
Yes,
not to
the
Germany.
American kids, by and large, of course, their loyalty was to America, but they had no choice but to go with their parents, who were German-born.
I see. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I appreciate very much your bringing this tragic episode in U.S. history to light. I mean, it seems to me it's a grave injustice perpetrated by the U.S. during World War II that has to be recognized. And I have two questions. One, was there any attempt on the part of those who were incarcerated in Crystal City to seek legal redress to what had happened to them? And second, was any compensation given to these internees, as was given to, as my understanding is, to the Japanese on the West Coast? Thanks.
No, the German and German Americans have mounted several efforts before Congress to attempt not to be paid reparations, but to be given an apology. And the answer has always been no. It was taken to the courts and everything, and the legal issue was about the fact that the Supreme Court decided that the Japanese Americans were taken on the basis of their race, which was true. And that, there were many, many more Germans and German Americans living in the United States than Japanese and Japanese Americans. And so the number of Germans that were taken into internment camps was far fewer than the number of Japanese. And they decided that, the Supreme Court decided that the Germans were taken based on their ethnicity. Now, the Germans say, what's the difference between race and ethnicity? But they have lost this, and it is my hope that at some point, what the German-American Internee Coalition is asking for is a full hearing before a congressional committee about what happened to approximately 60,000 Germans and German Americans during the war. But could I just also answer the second portion of that, and then I know, Cornelia, you'll need to stand up because we have people in the room who've lived this story, and so I don't want you to think I'm making it up. And so here, some of them at every event, the people come who are Border Patrol agents, whose children or whatever, and it's actually very interesting. But the question you raised at the end, as one of the reasons that it took so long to close the camp, is that after the war, the people in the camp didn't know when the war was over because everything was censored. They had no idea. So Matthias thought he was going back to Germany that was, in great shape. And the Japanese Americans couldn't even conceive that Japan would have lost the war. They could not even conceive it. So when they got on those trips to be traded, they thought they were being traded into peace. They did not think they were being traded into, or at least into, they had no idea that the situation was what it was. But once the internees got word that Japan was done and Germany was done, they did not want to be repatriated. And so they started filing lawsuits to overturn Truman's decision to deport everyone from Crystal City. Everybody was going to be deported. But the lawyers were smart enough that, for instance, Reverend Fukuda, who was the last Japanese out, was able to postpone it long enough that they just finally had let him go. And the same was true of Eb Fuhrer and his family and others that were on the German side. So one of the morals of the story is that it's much easier to start an internment camp than it is to stop one. And because these things go on and on and on. We were just talking over dinner that when Bergen-Belsen was liberated, there were still Jews living there in 1951. And not in good conditions. Cornelia, I just met Cornelia tonight, and her father was an enemy alien incarcerated in 4 different camps.
My father, Rudolf Mueller, he came to the United States in 1939. Mm-hmm. My mother was already here in 35. And we had other family members who were citizens since 1846. But when my father came, he was drafted as an alien, of all things, and the FBI came and apprehended him while he was working as a florist for the Widener estate, which big money back in Philadelphia. I'm from Philadelphia. I'm just saying that growing up, I never understood why the rest of the family members refused to speak German ever again. They refused to even talk to us because, as you probably all know, well, some of you probably know, these people were threatened never to speak of this ever. Mm-hmm. To anyone. And of course it's a dirty secret that about the Roosevelt years, but when my father died finally, I thought it's time to go because I started finding papers. I have original documents, I have letters, I have all this stuff that I was fortunate to get after 3 trips to NARA, because these records were still under a FOIA request. You could not get them. They said, oh, somebody has them out. I said, I'm an only child. Who would have them out? And I luckily got the records, all the transcripts, and I see what my father went through after death. And, it's unfortunate, but I am the only one that still speaks German in the family because they were afraid, because they knew, His brother worked for Tasty Cake. Tasty Cake, everybody likes Tasty Cake, right? They're bakers, they love Tasty Cake. But what happened was Tasty Cake didn't even want any Germans, and he was a U.S. citizen. And he went back and lost his life in Germany when he was deported. So, I'm glad this finally came to light. Thank you.
Thank you. It is. I didn't say this before. I was telling Kieran and Dee last night that when you left the camp at Crystal City, if you were a child or if you were a parent, you signed a secrecy oath that you would never speak of the camp and you would never speak of the exchange. And one of the reasons it took Ingrid 72 years to speak of it is she was still terrified of the government. She had she was one of these people that didn't have money in banks, and when I went to interview her, she asked me to please keep my cell phone outside and not bring it in the house because she considered it a personal tracking device. And so these things, the trauma from these events, as children of the children will attest to, there is enduring. It's enduring. Anyone else? One more question, because I think
I do have a question that's related to what we're talking about. I was wondering if you have thoughts on whether people really know these stories, about whether they teach it in school, or if you have like advice that you would give, to say a middle school or a high school history teacher about how to incorporate these stories into.
Well, it took a long time for the Holocaust stories to be taught in school. It did, and but this is not the story. The Japanese and Japanese American internment is taught. I mean, if you graduate from high school in the United States, you know the story of the 120,000, which is terrible. It's infamy. I'm not belittling it. It's awful. But these other stories, in smaller numbers, have not been taught, and because I think they're just coming out. I hope my book will be taught in high school somewhere, or if not high school, if it's too trashy for high school, maybe college. That'd be good. Anybody, one more, and then shall we say goodnight? You guys, I just have to say it's a snowy, awful day, and it's cold here. And I live in San Antonio, so travel well when you go home. And I just want to thank you very much for coming out on such a dreary night. Unless you have one more question, do you need?
One quick question. How much of this was known by the American public at the time it was going on? And the American public did know about the Japanese internment camps because it was a court case and went to the Supreme Court.
Yes. But no, the answer is nobody knew about this. This was a secret camp until 1945, and then the Immigration and Naturalization Service made a little movie about the Crystal City internment camp, and said it was this model camp. But the answer is no, and that case that you're talking about in the Japanese thing happened later in the war, and so the answer is, but nobody knew that these poor few Italians and a lot more Germans than we ever knew were interned in this country.
So there were no newspaper stories at all about it?
As the first newspaper stories that I heard about the Crystal City camp that I could find had to do when the people from the camp started filing lawsuits, and then the New York Times did stories on that. There were stories about the ships, the Gripsholm ships going over to Germany and to Japan, but the story of the exchange was not clear that at that time. So the answer is an incomplete telling of the story.
Yeah, thank you.
The Mercy ship. Yes.
Can I ask one question?
Certainly.
So, what was life like for them when they went back to Germany or Japan?
Oh, I started to read.
Time.
I started to read passages, but it's too sad to read because, of course, when the kids got to Germany and to Japan, they were American kids, and so they were treated like spies in Germany, and in Japan. They were regarded as the enemy, and so these poor children from Crystal City got beaten up before the war, during the war, and after the war. And that's why their resilience and their loyalty to this country is just so remarkable. I've asked myself sometimes if I were interned and sent to Syria by my country, I don't know if I'd be so forgiving. And it does make one question, what is our responsibility as citizens? And how much does it really cost us? Because it cost these people a lot, and their loyalty to America was just unshakable. So thank you very much. Thank you.